Okay, welcome everyone to today's University of Texas at Austin Energy Symposium for October 14th, 2025. So I'm Kerry King, a research scientist and assistant director at the Energy Institute, sponsor of this speaker series. Before I introduce today's speaker, I will point out the next two talks. Next week, we will have Jamie Galbraith here from LBJ School of Public Affairs, along with his colleague Jean Chen, who is at the University of Northern British Columbia. They will talk about their book that came out this year, Entropy Economics, Living Basis, Value and Production. So kind of high level economic energy talk. After that, we will have Ji Shin. He is from the City College of New York, and he will talk more about engineering, chemical engineering perspective of water responsive materials for evaporation energy harvesting with materials scientists. So it is a pleasure today to have Julie Black here from our Austin Energy, the utility, electric utility here for the city of Austin. The title of her talk is The Uniqueness of a Municipal Utilities Resiliency Program and how it fits into the ERCOT competitive wholesale market. So a little bit of background on Julie. She's the Energy Development Program Manager at Austin Energy for the Resiliency as a Service program, which is what we're going to hear a bit about today. Before that role, she was an economist at Austin Energy's Data Analytics and Business Intelligence Department, where she did load shape and geo and demographic analysis. For working at Austin Energy, she was with the Public Utility Commission of Texas. She has previously worked at the legislative aid for the House of Representatives, state of Texas. She has degrees in economics, philosophy from Columbia, and a master's from economics at University of Alabama. So a sort of summary of her abstract of her talk today is that following Winter Storm Uri, February 2021, I still remember that, or we're here in Texas at the time. Following that, Senate Bill 398 of that legislature, 87th legislature, passed a bill that requires municipal utilities to allow customers in the grocery store and food supply chain, so think H-E-B and other grocery stores, that allows them to partner with private generation companies, if they so choose to do so. And if they choose, they can install large backup generation that can provide full backup during a grid outage to their facility, and also interconnect with the municipal utilities distribution grid and provide services to the ERCOT wholesale market. So this was not a requirement to have to allow this before, and now it is. So Austin Energy designed their Resiliency as a Service program in response to satisfying that legislation. So with that said, we're going to hear about that today. So let's please welcome Julie Black from Austin Energy.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. King. I'm honored to be here. And I'm just going to start off this presentation with a few simple questions. And for the people in the room, you can do show of hands if you like. But how many of you were here in Austin during the extreme weather event of Winter Storm Uri, which happened during the second week of February 2021? So looks like a number of you, a fair number of you. How many of you remember or were without electricity during that extreme weather event? Okay, and this next question kind of brings me to my first slide, which is a little bit trickier, but does anybody know how many minutes the Texas ERCOT grid was from a full, complete blackout during the early morning hours of February 15th, 2021, during Winter Storm Uri? And if you don't know, that's okay, I'm gonna show it. You'd like to take a guess?
I think it was 7 minutes or so.
Very, very close, but a short amount of time. The actual amount of time, to be precise, was 4 minutes and 37 seconds, but you were very close. And this is pretty alarming. So even though that was a dire situation, it could have been much, much worse. So before I go into the details of this next slide, which goes into the specifics of what happened during the overnight hours of February 15th, I just want to emphasize electricity is the one industry in which supply has to meet demand instantaneously. And the measure of how well supply is meeting demand is grid frequency as measured in hertz. And if there's more generation than demand, the grid frequency rises. If there's more demand than generation, the grid frequency decreases. So what you have here on this slide, this shows the grid frequency during a certain time span of the overnight hours of February 15th. The blue line represents grid frequency in hertz. The x-axis shows the time period from 1:23 a.m. over there on the left up to about 2:03 a.m. And then the green dots, those show periods of times where large amounts of generation were tripping offline due to the extremely cold weather throughout Texas. And then the red dots, that shows where ERCOT, who is tasked with making sure with supply meets demand and the grid frequency stays at a certain level, that shows points at which ERCOT had to order load shed to deal with the grid frequency. So at 1:23 a.m., as you can see in that green dot, there was over 35,000 megawatts of generation ERCOT-wide that had already tripped offline to the very, very extreme weather conditions. And then right there at 1:23 a.m., ERCOT had gotten to the level where they had to order 1,000 megawatts of load shed. And as you can see, that did help the grid frequency a bit. But then as time went on that evening, it was kind of a game of cat and mouse because more and more and more generation kept tripping offline due to the extremely cold weather. And then ERCOT finally got to the point, if you look at the grid frequency at about 1:50 a.m., it started to take a nosedive. And the ERCOT grid operators, they were trained for situations such as this, but in order to keep the grid frequency at a healthy level, they had to order 3,000 megawatts of load shed, as you can see, about 1:50 a.m. Because if you see that black line, that's a threshold. That's showing 59.4 as far as the hertz. And if the grid gets below 59.4 and stays there for 9 minutes, then that's a situation where there's uncontrollable outages that pretty much it's a downward cascading scenario and the grid would go to a full blackout. So it was under that frequency for 4 minutes and 23 seconds. So it was, and again, 4 minutes, 37 seconds. That's how close we were to a full-on blackout. So ERCOT had to order 3,500 megawatts more of load shed. And as you can see, that kind of helped resuscitate the grid frequency. They were able to stabilize the frequency a bit. But if you were here in Austin, you know, Austin Energy was part of that load shedding scenario. So to kind of talk about our resiliency program and how we fit into the ERCOT design and the ERCOT market design, I'm going to divide this presentation into 3 different sections. First, I'm going to talk about the big picture energy framework in Texas and how municipal utilities fit into that framework, because it is rather unique. And then I'm going to talk about extreme weather events and the subsequent need for on-site backup generation. And then finally, I'll talk about the resulting resiliency program and the benefits to all Austin Energy customers. So the big picture energy market and framework and how municipal utilities fit into that. If there ever was any type of silver lining that came out of that extreme weather event that I just detailed, it's that some people started to learn a little bit more about the market design. And if any of you didn't know, maybe you learned, ERCOT, it's an island grid, meaning the ERCOT bulk grid system is not synchronously connected to the other major bulk grid system that's in the United States, the two other bulk grid systems. So what you see here on this slide, and I got this graphic from the ERCOT website. They have a very good website. It's just ERCOT.com if you'd ever like to visit it. But this shows the United States bulk power system. So in the gray area there, that represents the Eastern interconnection. It's made up of multiple states, as you can see. If there's ever an extreme weather event, it has multiple generation sources to draw upon so that the grid frequency can be at or about 60 hertz and supply can meet demand. And then over there in the blue area on the left, that's the Western interconnection, the bulk energy system. And again, you see it has multiple states. If there's ever an extreme weather event, they have multiple power plants to draw upon to make sure supply meets demand. And then in the turquoise type color, that's ERCOT. And as you can see, it's an island grid. If there's ever an extreme weather event, we are pretty much on our own. And this island grid situation, it's not necessarily due to any technical reasons. We could fairly easily interconnect to either one of the bulk grid systems, but it has more to do with deeply rooted historical, political, and even philosophical reasons. And just to kind of sum up the story, because Texas does not buy or sell electricity across state lines, that excludes us from FERC jurisdiction. And FERC, that stands for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So we are the only state right now that is not under FERC jurisdiction. And before I leave this slide, I'll just point out there are several what's called DC ties, direct current ties. So we can import and export limited amounts of energy through those ties, but those imports and exports, they have to be scheduled and they still exclude us from FERC jurisdiction. So even though we were this island grid up until the late 1990s and the early 2000s, when the electricity markets restructured in Texas, for the most part within that island grid, it was made up of neighboring vertically integrated utilities, meaning that the utilities owned and operated the power plants, the generation assets. They had their own transmission lines, their own distribution assets, and they serviced their own service territory. And this was made up of neighboring investor-owned utilities, co-ops in the rural areas, and also municipal utilities such as Austin Energy. Well, after electricity restructuring in the late 1990s, and in the late 1990s, the wholesale side became a deregulated competitive wholesale market. And then following in the early 2000s, the retail side became a deregulated retail market. But at that time, municipal utilities had the option to opt into retail competition. But due to the value of public power, the City of Austin City Council chose to remain a non-opt-in entity, which is sometimes referred to as a NOE. So that means we are a citizen-owned utility that does not operate for profit. So that is an aspect that makes us a little bit unique in ERCOT. And even though we are not involved in the retail side in that competitive market, just because of the geographical boundaries of this bulk grid system, we do have to compete in terms of our generation assets in the competitive wholesale market. So even NOEs, they have to schedule with ERCOT, the independent system operator, planned generation output. So we have an energy market operation teams that actually has to submit offer curves for all of our power plants, all of our generation units into the competitive wholesale market. And then we also have to communicate with ERCOT how we're going to cover our load, how we're going to buy our load from the ERCOT competitive wholesale market. So again, all generation entities and load entities, they submit offer and bid curves into the wholesale competitive market. And I will just note that that market, the pricing can be extremely volatile. So just to kind of go into a little bit more about why that market is so volatile in terms of the pricing in that competitive wholesale market. And this was a consideration that was taken into account as far as the resiliency as a service program that I'm going to talk about a little bit later in this presentation. But the ERCOT competitive wholesale market is the only energy-only market in the country. And it's only one of a few in the world. And what that means is generation units only get paid if they're actually producing energy. They do not get paid for standby availability, such as they do in other markets in the United States, such as the capacity market in PJM, which is in the northeastern part of the country. So even though, with that said, there are certain elements about the ERCOT market that do have a capacity component to it. There is a day-ahead market in ERCOT that procures energy just in case there's unforeseen events in the real-time market, such as a large generation unit tripping offline, such as one of the nuclear plants somewhere, in the ERCOT region, or if the wind forecast is way off, then they have a buffer, they have ancillary services. And then also there's a component of the resiliency program that I'm going to talk about for Austin Energy because of the unique structure that we have in that resiliency program that you will see at a later point in this presentation. But because electricity is the one industry in which supply has to meet demand instantaneously, the pricing structure has to be such to really incentivize generation units to come on and produce and offer energy when the supplies are tight in ERCOT, as well as incentivize demand to curtail if possible. And again, there's some generation units submit those offer curves. So this goes into a little bit more detail about how that pricing works and the offer curves and the dispatch software that ERCOT utilizes to make sure supply meets demand and sends those pricing signals. So the dispatch software, it's called Security Constrained Economic Dispatch, and it's referred to as SCED. There's many acronyms if you ever go into this industry. But over here on the right, this shows the ERCOT supply stack. And I will just note, this is for illustrative purposes. It's not precise. The generation mix in ERCOT is always changing, but it just kind of shows how this dispatch software works. So to explain what we have here, there on the x-axis, that represents the overall demand in ERCOT in gigawatts. And because supply has to meet demand in this graph, it also represents cumulative generation capacity. And then on the y-axis, that represents the marginal unit cost in dollars per megawatt hour for the different types of generation in ERCOT. And then the legend there on the bottom, that shows the different types of generation, the different colors represent the different types. And if you look over there at the left, at low demand, because renewables, there's no fuel costs associated with renewables. They can submit low offer curves. They can even bid in at negative prices. So the dispatch software is always calling upon the renewables to produce in the ERCOT market. And then it just goes up the offer curve stack and it matches all the offers at the point where it meets demand, and that's where the price clears. So kind of moving over to the right, nuclear, it's expensive to build, but it's relatively cheap to operate. Uranium, it's pretty cheap as a fuel source. So the nuclear plants are always producing, they serve base load, they always have a consistent output level. But then as you move further on to the right, then the SCED dispatch software starts to choose combined cycle gas turbines. There's some coal. There's less and less coal now in ERCOT because new resources are coming in. But I will point your attention over there to the right, and that's at high demand. So that's usually in the summer when everybody's running their air conditioners. The cumulative demand is usually about 80 gigawatts. And that's when ERCOT, the dispatch software, has to choose these peaker units, these gas turbines. They're sometimes referred to as combustion turbines, but they're peaker units. And they have a high heat rate, so their offer curves are a little bit higher. So when ERCOT's run through the lower priced offer curves, it then has to choose these peaker units. But they are a very useful tool because they can follow base points. They can help ERCOT be very precise in making sure supply meets demand. But again, those are utilized when the supply-demand balance is pretty tight in ERCOT. So this SCED dispatch, it runs every 5 minutes or less to produce locational marginal prices at each node. But settlement point prices, they're the average of 3 SCED runs. They're calculated every 15 minutes for financial payouts to generators and correspondingly financial charges to loads. And just to kind of go into a little bit more detail, in December of 2010, the ERCOT market transitioned on the wholesale side to a zonal market, or I'm sorry, to a nodal market. It used to be a zonal market, but the retail side stayed a zonal market. So a little bit more about what that means is each electrical bus or each substation or each point in ERCOT where energy is either injected into the high voltage transmission lines or energy is withdrawn from the high voltage transmission lines at 60 kV or above, that's considered a node. So each node receives a locational marginal price every 5 minutes or less. Again, that helps ERCOT make sure supply meets demand at a certain frequency. But the settlement point prices, they're generated every 15 minutes, and they're an average of the 5-minute LMPs. Generators are settled at each node. Load is settled at each load zone. That's an average of all the electrical buses within the load zone. The load retail side is still, again, like I mentioned, a zonal market. The generation side is a nodal market. So just to kind of summarize some of this stuff, I know it's pretty dense, but to talk more about how Austin Energy as a municipal utility is unique within this ERCOT market and how some of these factors were taken into consideration in designing the resiliency program that I'm going to talk about here in a minute in the next few slides. So I'll just go through these bullet points. When there is no transmission congestion in ERCOT, all of those LMPs are the same. However, if load is behind a transmission constraint, SCED, that dispatch software, it actually has to go to a higher point on that offer curve stack to satisfy load in that area. Alternatively, if generation is behind a transmission constraint and can't get out to serve load in the rest of the ERCOT region, then SCED, that dispatch software, has to go to a lower point on that offer curve stack in that area. And this bullet here in bold, again, this kind of highlights how we're unique as a municipal utility. Because Austin Energy is a non-opt-in entity, a NOE, in the ERCOT region, Austin Energy is both a load-serving entity, an LSC that must buy energy from ERCOT, the ERCOT wholesale market, to cover its load, and it's also a qualified scheduling entity that must submit offer curves, as I mentioned before, to sell power from its generation assets in the ERCOT market. Well, if the settlement point prices are higher in the Austin Energy load zone, when we cover our load, then the settlement point prices are for Austin Energy generation assets, certain power plants in other parts of Texas, then the pricing difference that can factor into a higher, what's called a power supply adjustment portion of all Austin Energy customer bills. And this PSA, this power supply adjustment, it reflects the pricing costs associated with Austin Energy buying and selling in the ERCOT market. So kind of moving into the resiliency program, the resiliency as a service, the generation assets can help resolve this imbalance by allowing Austin Energy to utilize the assets in the Austin Energy load zone. And again, that can help lower this power supply adjustment portion to all of Austin Energy customers. And I'm going to talk a little bit more to explain this more graphically. I'm going to point your attention to this graphic over here on the right. This is a screenshot, and I got this again from the ERCOT website, but it shows locational marginal prices during a certain interval it was in August, so it was one of the peak months of the summer. And if you look at the legend, and I know it's hard to see, but high prices are represented by the dark red colors, and that goes on a downward scale all the way down to the dark blue prices, and those are where prices are even negative. So again, this is LMPs, locational marginal prices. So the prices are different in different locations because of transmission congestion. So if you see that red area over there with high prices, and then I'm going to draw your attention to the middle graphic. These are the ERCOT load zones. So Austin Energy has its own load zone. So I don't have a pointer, but the red dot, that red kind of blob right there in the middle of the green, that is Austin Energy's load zone. And then down there, a little bit to the southwest, that blue area, that's the load zone for CPS. That's the municipal utility in San Antonio. And then the other larger color regions, those represent the larger load zones where all of the competitive retail electric providers operate. But if you'll notice, on that day, the high prices were right there close to the Austin Energy load zone. So we were paying higher prices for our load. And then I'll point your attention to the graphic on the right. So that is Austin. Oh, I'm sorry, the left. So over here. So again, things turn around looking at two different screens. But Austin, so this is Austin Energy's generation across Texas. And this is from Austin Energy's Generation and Climate Protection Plan to 2035. It's page 14. It's a public-facing document. It's on our website. It's a pretty good read if you'd ever like to read it. But this graphic shows our generation assets, and the different colored dots represent different types of generation that we have. And because we're trying to move more and more to renewable generation assets, a lot of the wind blows in North Texas and in the coastal regions. So that's what you see in the green dots. So we contract, we enter into these power purchase agreements where there's a lot of utility scale wind in Texas. And then the yellow dots represent utility scale solar farms. So again, there's a lot of sun in West Texas. We do have some local solar here. And then we do have some generation locally, as you can see there on the right side, and the different types of generation that we have. But again, if you look back to that graphic over there on the right, that instant, that day on August 29th, the generation assets were earning less revenue, relatively speaking, to what Austin Energy was paying for load in our load zone. And again, that funnels through to all Austin Energy customer bills when that happens. And that's, again, an aspect that makes us unique. Do you have a question?
Just a relatively follow-up question that's
Sure.
aligned here is there, you have an explanation for why the prices are high in Austin versus other places?
You know, it has to do again with transmission congestion, and I'll go into this. Actually, that's a perfect segue question. And well, I've been talking about pricing and congestion pricing and how SCED has to go to a higher point on the offer curve stack when there's transmission constraints to satisfy load in that area. But to that question, I talked earlier about how the market structure framework before electricity restructuring, in the early 2000s, we were neighboring vertically integrated utilities. So kind of there in that bottom graphic on the right, when utilities size their transmission lines, they can do that when they're vertically integrated. So they can make sure that the energy that was produced by the power plant, that their transmission lines were sized appropriately to get that to the load of their end use customers. Well, when the market restructured and you had the generation side became deregulated, a competitive wholesale market, the retail side later on became deregulated. What you had formed was this transmission superhighway in ERCOT, which is kind of the graphic on the top there. So all generation assets have open access to the high voltage transmission lines at 60 kV or above. And when it restructured, just because there's generation assets in certain parts of the state, and then there's load centers that are very far away in other parts of the state, there's a lot of congestion on that transmission superhighway. So I'll just point out the wires and poles section, the transmission section, that cannot be deregulated. There can't be competition in the transmission realm, because that'd be ridiculous if you had competing transmission lines in your backyard. So that part is still regulated by the PUC. But you have these transmission service providers. So they have transmission assets at 60 kV or above. And they have to size the transmission assets, their transmission lines, to meet the peak load amounts of the summer. So there's something called the ERCOT 4CP. So that's the 4 coincident peaks. So the peak 15-minute intervals throughout ERCOT during the summer, during June, July, August, and September. And each distribution service provider that has transmission assets below 60 kV, they feed into that transmission superhighway. And some of them have more load during those peak times, but there's something called the annual transmission cost of service. And again, to answer your question, as far as like, there's some areas that there's more load on that transmission service highway, and it causes more need for capital upgrades. But each distribution service provider has to pay their load ratio share to each transmission service provider. And again, this resiliency program, that was taken into consideration, because that's another cost that factors into customer bills, is how much we have to pay in our annual transmission cost of service. So again, it does get high. The price is not only transmission pricing, but there is that annual transmission cost of service. So, and again, the resiliency as a service program, when the people designed this and worked together, we considered all these costs that it could help lower customer bills. So this is always a bit interesting to look at. And again, I referred to the ERCOT website. Let me see if I can get in here. It shows, it has some really good dashboards. So right now, and I'll try to speak to your question. Again, these are the settlement point prices. The blue line represents the Austin Energy load zone. The orange line represents the hub average. So that's all the electrical buses and all the other load zones. It looks like there's not too much transmission congestion right now. So we wouldn't be paying higher prices there. But moving back, and we should see this in the, and it's interesting you asked that question, because has anybody noticed where there might be transmission congestion? Because it looks like there is some in other parts of the state. It's right up here. For some reason, there's a transmission constraint. So these prices are higher in that area. And then luckily that looks to be a little bit lower in the Austin Energy load zone. And then it goes down to really low prices over here. So again, all of this for Austin Energy, that does translate into customer bills, the power supply adjustment. And again, I would just, if you are interested, they're really good dashboards here on the ERCOT website. Shows system-wide prices. It shows what the demand is right now in ERCOT. And and storage resources. It's interesting to look at what they're doing in the real time. So I'm gonna cross out of here so I get a chance. Again, that's a very interesting website. And speaking of which, this is a screenshot of the pricing during Winter Storm Uri, that extreme weather event. So because SCED had gone through all the generation supply, prices shot to the cap. And at the time, that was $90,000 a megawatt hour. So actually, I'm going to go back here and just kind of look at, where they are right now. So, looks like we're down around $40 or so per megawatt hour. But again, that's very, very different than Winter Storm Uri. And those were sustained at those prices for days during that extreme weather event. But what's kind of interesting, even then, there was generation that couldn't get out to help serve the rest of Texas. So you see these dark blue areas down there at the bottom left. So that was generation that couldn't get out to help the rest of Texas because of transmission constraints. So moving on, just speaking of extreme weather events and the resulting need for backup generation, not just backup generation for the sheer fact that it can provide electricity to large commercial and industrial customers, but again, it can help solve some of these pricing issues for all Austin Energy customers. So during Winter Storm Uri, and actually during any extreme weather event, something interesting was happening to the grocery stores. And there was one grocery store chain that had actually been partnering with a private generation company that specializes in installing these peaker-like plants on their premises. So during extreme weather events like Winter Storm Uri, and a lot of the grocery stores, these locations where they had partnered with this private generation company were in the deregulated parts of ERCOT, they actually maintained full power during Winter Storm Uri, and also they've maintained full power during hurricanes and other extreme weather events. Well, at the time, kind of like Dr. King mentioned at the beginning, Austin Energy did not allow private generation companies to partner with the grocery stores in our service territory because, again, we have an energy market operations team. We're in a unique situation. This energy market operations team at Austin Energy has to orchestrate how they're going to buy and sell energy in the ERCOT market. And then if you have a private generation company that comes in and is actually interconnected to the grid and offers in ERCOT services, that becomes a little chaotic. So at the time of Winter Storm Uri, the grocery stores, a lot of them, they had the traditional smaller backup generation units that run on diesel that's not interconnected to the distribution grid. And those traditional generation units only allow the grocery stores to maintain partial power. They keep the cash registers running and the lights on. But if any of you remember going to the grocery stores in Austin, a lot of them had no produce on the shelves because based on federal guidelines, if there's an outage lasting more than 2 hours, just for the safety of the community, they have to throw out all their perishables, have to throw out about $500,000 worth of food just because of spoilage issues. So during Winter Storm Uri, or actually the legislative session that happened, that was going on during Winter Storm Uri, there was a bill that passed. It's Senate Bill 398. And at the end of that bill, there was an amendment. It's Section 3. But it says that grocery stores, if they so choose, NOEs such as Austin Energy, which is a municipal utility, we have to allow them to partner with a private generation company, if they so choose, to install backup generation, these large backup generators that can allow them to maintain full power, including all their freezer units and their refrigeration units. And we have to allow them to interconnect to our distribution grid and allow them to enter into ERCOT market services if they so choose. But again, because we're unique and it gets complicated and it would be kind of chaotic if they were offering into ERCOT, the NOEs have the right of first refusal, so we can buy the generation from the private generation companies, and then we have control of those assets. So that's kind of a factor of how the resiliency program was designed. And so, just again, we created this program that, kind of in response to Senate Bill 398 to allow the immediate backup protection, full backup protection, and then also it benefits the community as well as helps to lower bills for all Austin Energy customers. Because again, these power plants, these peaker units can be utilized, these assets in the ERCOT market to help bring down the cost for all customers. So it's kind of optimizing what we have if the grocery stores so choose to have these generation assets on their premises. And then I'll also just kind of quickly note, do you all remember anything that happened in terms of the water supply during Winter Storm Uri or other events if you were here? There was something kind of at the end. Exactly, a boil water notice. And that was because there were certain water treatment plants that lost power. Didn't just happen in Austin, it happened throughout the state. So there was this other bill that passed during that legislative session that said that water utilities and wastewater utilities, they have to file an emergency preparedness plan with the TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, explaining how they're going to maintain their services during an extended power outage lasting more than 24 hours. And the only way a lot of them could actually do this would be to have on-site backup generation. So we are offering, we have this program if any of the water utilities would like to utilize it, because the status quo is right now, water utilities across the state to comply with this Senate Bill 3, a lot of them are bringing in diesel generators so they can have this emergency preparedness plan for the winter months. And it's not a very clean option, but it does allow them to satisfy the requirements of Senate Bill 3. So moving on, the resulting program. So this is the program structure. And again, it's unique. It's not too straightforward, but because of all this uniqueness of us being a municipal utility in the ERCOT market, the program structure in any potential RAS project, there would be 3 entities. You would have the host customer, which is shown up there at the top. So that's the grocery store, for example. And then down there to the bottom right, that's the generation company that I referred to. So the vendor generation company, they install, own, and maintain the generators. That would be, for example, on the premises of these grocery stores here in Austin. And then over there on the bottom left, that's Austin Energy. And because I mentioned we had this energy market operations team that has to orchestrate the buying and selling of power in the ERCOT market, Austin Energy would pay the generation company a capacity payment, which in turn would allow Austin Energy to maintain control of that asset and utilize that asset when there's peak pricing in the ERCOT market or there's a potential 4CP event. So they would utilize it to help lower the bills for all of Austin Energy customers. So the the capacity payment, that is paid for by Austin Energy's power supply adjustment that I referred to earlier. But then if Austin Energy realizes any revenues by offering that generation unit into the ERCOT market, because we're a citizen-owned utility, we're a nonprofit, any revenues go back into that power supply adjustment. And that goes back to all Austin Energy customers. And then because the generation company is getting that capacity payment, they are able to offer that backup generation unit, the larger unit that can provide full power, that can actually keep the freezer units and the refrigeration units on. They're able to provide that at a lower cost to these grocery stores that would choose to use them. So it is unique, I will say, but just kind of in closing, I know this is a lot. There are many options exist on both the supply and the demand side of the equation for the ERCOT Texas grid. And the electricity sector and the resiliency options in Texas, they can benefit from smart, creative problem solvers. So if any of you would like to go into that industry, we can use smart, creative problem solvers. And then the generation mix and the demand respond mix in Texas, ERCOT, Austin Energy has and will evolve in the future to optimize how supply meets demand in all time intervals. So that's all I have. I can take any questions I have.
All right, questions online that I need to get to, but we'll start room.
Thank you for coming. How do you think nuclear energy fits into your resilience plan?
Well, right now in ERCOT, there's two nuclear plants. There's the South Texas project in Bay City, and then there's Comanche Peak up in kind of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So that's ERCOT wide. Right now, I know there's talk in the industry about these small modular reactors. And again, City Council is our governing body. So we kind of follow what City Council would like to do and their guidance. And I believe there was some mention of that in the generation plan to 2025, because nuclear is very clean. There's no emissions. So I know it's in some of the discussions. So that's a good question, because I know it's the entire industry is kind of looking at that, especially with all the new load coming on with data centers and everything. So thank you.
All right, can I ask one, maybe try to combine a couple questions online. So I guess two related questions are: how many grocery stores are engaging in this program? And how does that seem similar to how much they're engaging in other areas of Texas with backup power programs at grocery stores?
Right now there are prospective customers, and we can't go really into detail as far as customer information, but we do say that we have this program, we've designed it, so we have it for the grocery stores that choose to do this program. And again, these are like larger generation assets, and it involves quite a bit of contracting work, and so it takes a while. But we have complied with all the requirements of Senate Bill 398 of the Texas legislature, so we do have it ready to go, and there are prospective customers. So
related, then I'll come to the room. And so in terms of these contracts, how does this question of how does the private generator, you mentioned you give them a capacity payment, I guess how does that payment just get negotiated through Austin Energy, or does the City Council have to approve whatever that rate is?
well, there is a certain contract, and Austin Energy does work with the vendor generation company, and there's a lot of back and forth, and we comply with all the legal requirements, and then there's also a contract between the generation company and the host customer that we don't oversee. But again, and within the contract between Austin Energy and the vendor energy company, there's a general contract, but for any project, there would be a project addendum contract that would lay out the specifics of that capacity payment and just other very detailed components of that contractual arrangement.
I feel like I have to ask about residential batteries. Is there any option of Austin Energy working with a company like Base Power or something to provide the same service for residential customers in the future?
There's a similar question online about other branded or virtual power plants. Doing such a pilot program and for these, so whatever you can say on that.
Sure, those are topics that are definitely coming up in the industry as a whole. Right now, this program is for commercial and industrial customers, but the industry as a whole, I mean, all municipal utilities they're looking at batteries. And I can get back to you on the specifics of Austin Energy. I know, and this is not my area, but we are looking at a utility scale battery option for the utility. And as far as residential customers, that discussion is always on the table because, batteries are very clean, but my program itself, right now, it doesn't include that. The program, like I said, it could evolve, but right now, but that is a good question because that is coming up quite a bit in the industry as a whole. So thank you.
All right, we ask one follow-up and then I'll come to the room. It's the question whether your RAAS program, resiliency as a service, is restricted to grocery stores. And did you imply it's any industrial and commercial customer?
Well,
engage?
Right now at the current time, obviously grocery stores, and then I did mention the mention of water utilities because they do have to file that emergency preparedness plan, explaining how they're going to maintain full power during an extended outage so that they don't have to do a boil water notice. And some water utilities, the near term, current term way they can comply is, again, they have to bring in these diesel generators. So we are offering that right now if they want a cleaner option. So it's open to that.
So not only grocery stores.
It's
Or
it's kind of complicated, but yeah. So it's like we have it available. I'll just say that.
okay.
So.
My question is, did ERCOT have the dashboard that you shared before Winter Storm Uri, or is that a new development, part of the response related to transparency?
That's a good question, and I can't remember. I mean, I love going and checking the dashboards on the ERCOT website. I think it's fascinating. But I do know after Winter Storm Uri, they did upgrade a lot of their dashboards, and just it's very good information for the public if they're interested. And like I said, it has the current pricing, the current system demand. It looks at overall the aggregated storage in ERCOT and what it's doing at certain levels and how it's charging at low prices when there's a lot of renewables, and then it discharges when the sun automatically goes down at night. And then so it's kind of fascinating to look at. But I know there were definitely upgrades after that extreme weather event. So
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is enhanced. I think they had something, but it is, I think, improved. It's very. I like it as well. Anyway.
Oh,
I guess regarding the program,
Uh-huh.
RAS,
Uh-huh.
do you envision, I guess its scope expanding beyond just, I guess, groceries and water utilities? Like, do you envision other entities being like allowed to join the system?
You know, it is a program that can encompass, it does have that potential. You know, city council is our governing body, so we follow their guidance on what they would like us to do. And, you know, of course, working with others at Austin Energy, that's a very good question. And, you know, different aspects of it may evolve at some point. You know, it may utilize, even at grocery stores, maybe it will utilize storage. You know, right now with storage, duration is kind of a barrier because, you know, 4 hours is kind of like the longest it could discharge at any one time. And, you know, storage is great, but during a grid outage, a major grid outage, you need kind of longer duration options. But that is a good question. We shall see. Thank you.
Yeah, my question was on just like the trends in the offer curves that you're seeing as the supply curve, as ERCOT has brought on more renewables that could bring the supply curve down, but at the same time, it's going to be a point where demand is increasing. So curious just on some of these trends in, electricity pricing that's been talked about. Are we seeing rates increase, or is the supply curve going down? We kind of balance that. But curious on your thoughts on maybe where the rates are right now, seeing this new demand coming in at the time also we're putting new supply out, how that's all balancing.
Sure, that's a great question. And you know, we have a team that looks at that all the time, the energy market operations team. And it is an interesting question that kind of brings in all these other questions because, right now with all these renewables, we're seeing low prices kind of overall. And then when, the sun goes down, then it does bump up a bit, but then storage has come in. So that's kind of brought down that solar ramp up, or the solar ramp down, but then the pricing going up. But again, there's this talk of data centers coming in and that will increase load. So that will kind of change the overall pricing, the curves. And, one thing about the market design, it does have pretty low barriers to entry. So if there's a generation resource that can, kind of follow the dispatch instructions of ERCOT, and they're able to compete, it is kind of open to different options. And it is interesting to watch. As far as where that'll go in the future, I mean, I can check and get back with you through Carrie, just kind of what they think. But that is something that they're trying, I guess, to keep tabs on, because it is ever evolving. And we don't know how much load is going to show up actually with data centers. I think that's a big question everywhere in the country, but it's still kind of unknown. So.
Here's a question online. I guess it's slightly off topic, but going to one of your slides, just to maybe understand this power supply adjustment chart. You showed a map where there are Austin owns generation, or wind farms, solar farms, and generators, nuclear power plant, co-own in different parts of the state. But in the question here, I think is insightful. I guess Austin Energy is not directly, let's just say, a solar farm in West Texas. I don't know how many Austin owns versus has a power purchase agreement, so that the payment Austin would be making is whatever's in the power purchase agreement cost, and not necessarily the wholesale price in West Texas at any moment. True statements? Yeah.
That is very insightful, because I was actually kind of asking that question internally, even just last week. But for the most part, we do enter into power purchase agreements, and all of that is kind of tricky financially, because you have to pay kind of a set amount for a power purchase agreement, but then in the wholesale market, the prices, they do fluctuate, so it's kind of like you have to analyze some of the financial risks of that, but we do enter into power purchase agreements for those generation assets across the state.
Okay,
How about hospitals, or do they have like their own generator or like what happened back in the day?
I'm sure a lot of them do because that is critical load and, again, this is not my wheelhouse, but when they do order load shed, and I'll double check on this and get back with you, but there's certain circuits that are off limit as far as load shed because of critical load, like when it's a life or death situation like that. So it's a good question.
What I've heard that, like, for example, this area near the hospital, that area did not have a power outage. Do they have like separate perimeter?
It's it is because they're critical load. When there's ordered load shed, there are certain circuits again that people at Austin Energy, at ERCOT, and different control centers are aware of where that critical load is, and and by no means would they ever want a critical load customer without power. So it's a very good question.
if you have further questions on that, so myself and about 10 other colleagues wrote a summary report of what happened during Winter Storm Uri. It's a white paper on the Energy Institute website, so you can follow with me if you want to get a link to that, but what Julie's saying is roughly correct. I was one of the lucky people that was on a circuit somewhere nearby that may have just been deemed critical for I had no influence on that, but my power was not go out, so I have a lucky spot for whatever reason. And maybe we'll end on this question, which you may not be able to answer, is how does your ROS, Resiliency as a Service program, compare to or differ from other similar programs? For example, CPS Energy, that would have been principal, had to also conform to Senate Bill 398 because they're a municipal utility or other municipal utilities in Texas. Are you aware of differences?
That is a good question, and I know CPS, they do have a resiliency as a service program. The structure of it, at least previously, was a little bit different than ours. I don't know exactly how they do it, but I know, like in our structure with that capacity payment, that does give the utility a little bit more control over that asset, whereas their resiliency program is designed a little bit different. I know their resiliency program, they had a little bit more, well, they had more challenges in terms of the infrastructure to actually allow their resiliency program, but they did work through it. And it took them a while. It took them a couple of years to actually offer this, and they did offer it. And actually, during Winter Storm Uri, so the grocery store chains there, some of them did have these large backup generators that maintained power during that extreme weather event. So.
So at least we have some, well, at least collectively, some public experience with interacting with a major event, so.
That is true.
Okay.
That is true.
Good.
I can answer affirmative.
Yes,
Yes, does.
Perhaps influence the legislation. All right, well, we'll just end it right there, so let's thank Julie Black.